Everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. This is Alex Sachon. In today's episode, I'm going to be beginning a new series on the topic of technocracy. And for those of you who are unaware, technocracy is a trend that's happening in our economic and governance systems. And it is becoming increasingly important and increasingly impactful in the way that our societies are governed and in the way that we live our lives. So it's an emerging trend, but it is set to become increasingly dominant. And I argue in my recent book, The Coming World Nation, that technocracy is being prepared as the replacement for capitalism. And in my book, I devote a whole chapter to it. Actually, most of the book interweaves with this idea of technocracy, but there's specifically a chapter on technocracy in my book called Technocracy, Government in the Scientific Age. And this series that I'm going to be beginning with you today is an excerpt from that chapter. We're going to begin in this first episode with the very first section of this chapter. It's called An Introduction to Technocracy. And in this introduction, I'm going to overview and outline my unique angle into the topic of technocracy. Because as you'll find as we go through this series, that my interpretation of technocracy is often quite different than what you'll see from other analysts. And so we'll be exploring what my take is as we go through with this. And I'll also be popping up and talking a little bit more about what makes my take different than other people's takes. As we go through this series, I'm also going to be adding some supplementary material that'll be posted on the podcast and YouTube and also on my Substack. And you can find links to everything I've done at alexsachon.com. I just want to give a couple quick updates on a few other things that I've been working on. And the first thing is, and the most significant thing is, I'm in the early stages of starting a nonprofit, and it's going to be a philosophy-centered nonprofit that initially is going to be dedicated to the task of educating current and future world leaders in philosophical thinking, philosophical worldview, and really trying to make the case to current and future leaders about the need to resurrect philosophy and basically have philosophy rise as a guiding force in our society, whereas today it's basically become an irrelevant factor. So that's one of the main focuses of this nonprofit, but my ultimate goal is to expand and turn it into something that's more like a think tank. And part of it will have an outreach focus, part of its research focus, and then part of its advocacy, and maybe even investment and consulting aspect to it. So that's my long-term goal. And my hope also is that this will be the new home for my work, past, present, and future. So that's something that I'll be sharing more information about as we go. Another project I have planned for the near future is to do a revised and expanded version of my 2023 book, Manly P. Hall, The Maestro of Esoteric Philosophy. And I want to add 2 or 3 new chapters and also do a bit of a revision of the writing and just try to improve it as much as possible. And I'm contemplating submitting it to be published with a mainstream publisher, but I might also just continue to self-publish. So we'll see about that, but that'll be coming up hopefully near the holidays. If I self-publish it, if I go to a publisher, it'll be out sometime next year, I think. Another project I'm working on, this will be something I self-publish, but I want to convert a lot of the work I've done over the past 3 or 4 years on my podcast and on my Substack. I want to refine some of that and get that out on Amazon in the form of a series of study guides intended to walk you through the essential teachings of Manly P. Hall. So this is going to be a Manly P. Hall study guide series, and it's going to be available on Amazon and also on my Substack. And the first part of the series, which I've just finished putting together, it should be out in a couple weeks, is a collection of 10 of my favorite Manly P. Hall lectures. These are actually ones, the majority of them are ones I've done analyses of on my podcast in the past. So what I've done in this series is I've taken 10 of Manly P. Hall's lectures and I've outlined the main portions of them. And I have abridged and curated them so they're at the utmost readability. And so they're enhanced in terms of reader comprehension. And I've broken them up into sections and I'll offer commentary on each of the sections. So this book has a couple purposes behind it. One is to serve as a guide for students to better understand the teachings of Manly P. Hall. And this is for either advanced students or even introduction students. It's really designed to be the ideal introduction to Manly P. Hall's books. So if you were looking to get something for someone that you wanted to introduce Manly Hall to, you could get this work for them, and this would be the best single starting point because I break things down to such a easily digestible manner, and because I'm offering commentary throughout it. And I've also customized some of the writing, and I note this in the introduction to the book. I'm not offering the direct translation of the transcripts, but I've abridged them and somewhat curated them to maximize readability. And so the first volume is under 200 pages. I want to do a series of these that curate the most important lectures that I think he's done, or at least some of my favorite ones. I mean, he's done so many outstanding ones, but I want to do a series where I guide the reader through some of his essential lectures. So you can listen to the lecture and then have this guide to help your comprehension of the material. But the book is also designed to stand alone. This one should be out in a couple weeks, and then I plan on going through some of the older series that I've done on my podcast and on my Substack. For example, my series on Mahayana Buddhism, my series on Atlantis, my series on Plato, Pythagoras, the early mystical history of America. All these things I want to convert into these study guides. So I'm going to go back to the material and fine tune it, and I'll have all that out on Amazon. And that'll be the next batch of writings that I put out. And then I also have my next big book, which will be the follow-up to my recent book, The Coming World Nation. And that's really going to be outlining how I see philosophy can be used to design the next form of government, which is kind of an ambitious task, but that's what the theme of the book is going to be, is governance in the age of technocracy, but also arguing for a rise of philosophy to come in and transform our understanding of science and how we use technology, and bring religious elements into science and vice versa, scientific elements into religion. These are all the things that philosophy can offer us. So this is what the goal of that book is going to be, is to lay out the vision for how we can realize Plato's concept of the philosophic empire, or Francis Bacon's concept of the new Atlantis. So that book is going to really be the mission statement of this nonprofit that I want to start. It's going to be that mission statement for that organization. So those are all the projects I have working on, but I'm excited to be sharing with you this new study guide that'll be out again in a couple weeks. So keep your eyes out for that. And without further ado, I want to jump into today's episode. So I'm going to be reading out the beginning section of this chapter on technocracy. That's, again, it's from my book, The Coming World Nation, which was published just a couple months ago. And this first section, again, it's called An Introduction to Technocracy. And you're going to get my unique interpretation of this phenomena that's gradually spreading around the world and infiltrating every aspect of society. And that's this transformation from capitalism to technocracy. Okay, let's jump into it. An introduction to technocracy. Actually, the section's really called An Introduction to the Technocratic Superstate. And you'll see what I mean by that as we go. And again, this is chapter 6 in my book, The Coming World Nation. There is a precise historical alignment between the timing of when a capitalist oligarchy solidified its power over America, the Federal Reserve was established, the U.S. made a permanent turn towards imperial expansion, the flying airship sightings of the 1890s appeared and disappeared, Nikola Tesla's career skyrocketed and then plummeted, and Einstein's relativity model replaced the ether model as the foundation of modern physics. All those things are things I talked about in the previous chapter, chapter 5, just so you know. All of these events that I just mentioned happened within the span of 2 decades. What are we to make of this? Already by this point in history, so around the turn of the 20th century, as historian Carroll Quigley cataloged in his book Tragedy and Hope, the American oligarchy, which really rose during the Gilded Age, this was 1870s to roughly 1910. This American oligarchy had been coordinating with and at the same time jockeying for position against their British counterparts in the effort of establishing a global system of financial capitalism. So the capitalist class, the transatlantic capitalist class, had a common interest in establishing a global capitalist paradigm. And it wasn't necessarily a zero-sum game in terms of if the Americans were the ones who were able to establish the dollar as the basis of the system. It wasn't like the capital from England would be excluded. It just wouldn't be they just wouldn't be the dominant decision makers in the system. But once the system of global capitalism was set up, it incorporated the capital from all these different European sectors. So that's what I mean by these oligarchs have been courting with on one level, but they were also jockeying for position within the global financial system for dominance. So this was all happening around the turn of the 20th century, right before World War One, and right before the establishment of the Federal Reserve. So the plan was for this Anglo-American elite, this transatlantic Anglo-American elite, to enthrone themselves atop a global central banking cartel, becoming what F. William Engdahl facetiously called the gods of money. He has a book by that name. To accomplish this goal, America had to be converted from a constitutional democracy into an imperial behemoth capable of enforcing its oligarchy's global financial hegemony. The institutions and networks that the oligarchy established in America to grow its financial imperium form collectively what modern analysts call the deep state. So the deep state is this structure, the shadow government. This is all built around this network of private financial capital that became enthroned within the U.S. government in the form of the Federal Reserve. So that's the central institution around which the so-called deep state has formed. And the orientation of this entire apparatus is globalism, is towards global financial super system that is centered around the private interest and private capital, the private ownership of a very small exclusive class, basically neo-feudalism. So the reach of this deep state extends out from Wall Street to influence all three branches of government, the economy, media, the educational system, and almost every other sector of American society. J.P. Morgan was one of the key power players within the structure of American oligarchy, and he was right in the thick of its conspiracies when his fateful encounter with Nikola Tesla went down in 1905. Again, this is something I discussed in the previous chapter of the book. Tesla's proposed world wireless invention and innovation stood to destroy the entire imperial economic vision that Morgan and his fellow oligarchs had been working so hard to develop. After learning of what Tesla's true intentions for the project were, which is global free energy, he moved to shut down Tesla's work. Morgan wanted to see the oligarchy's plan for a U.S.-centered global central banking cartel come to fruition, and he was not about to let the ambitions of some rogue inventor interfere with that agenda, which by that point was very close to completion. The Federal Reserve Act was passed, after all, less than a decade after his famous showdown with Tesla. Morgan's investments in Edison and General Electric made him particularly well positioned within the structure of America's deep state, giving him a controlling stake in the nation's electrical cartel. He also held dominant financial stakes in a number of other major industries and economic sectors, positioning his banking house to displace the Rothschilds as the foremost power player in global finance. But the House of Morgan's rise above the Rothschilds, they were formerly partners, but that Rothschilds were really based out of London. So if Morgan was going to displace the Rothschilds, that would have to mean that America would actually be displacing the British Empire. Because remember, at this point in time, the British Empire is still the dominant force in world economics and world trade and still has the world's reserve currency, officially. So Morgan had a vested interest in this imperial expansion of America. And so the great game of the 19th century and early 20th century geopolitics was really the story of these oligarchical factions competing with each other and using the institutions of nation states to do so, to do battle with each other. That's what was really the underlying trend that was driving the wars and conflicts and various other events that were taking place within the 100-year period, really from the 1850s to 1950s. So given this context, we know what Morgan's motivations were for shutting down Tesla's Wardenclyffe project. Likewise, we can easily put together why no other financial backer stepped up to fund Tesla's revolutionary inventions in the latter decades of his life, after his falling out with Morgan. So the pattern appears to be quite simple. Tesla's ambitions threatened to destroy the oligarchy's imperial agenda, and therefore his research and ambitious ideas, inventions shouldn't be allowed to continue, and they really weren't. He never found any significant funding for his projects after his time with Morgan, and he died essentially broke. So while this all seems relatively clear, and again, this will make more sense if you read through the previous chapter in the book, because it's all about the story of Tesla and what was going on in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And as I'll argue in this chapter, I think during the same period, we also saw the covert formation of a secret governance institution that's beyond even what we call the deep state or what we call the oligarchy. There's something even beyond that, and that formed around this period as well, too, I argue. That's what I call the technocratic superstate. At this original early time, it would have been just a seed of that. But basically, the idea is an institution dedicated to science and technology, specifically specializing in a field that of science and technology, a field that is now classified that most people don't know anything about, but it has to do with the science of the ether. And the idea that space is not an empty vacuum, but space is a field of universal energy. And so that's a major paradigm changing discovery, and it has big implications for science in every field. It has big implications for technology in every domain. And this was also going on. The discovery and development of this secret scientific institution was also taking place within the backdrop of these events that historians can study more directly, involving the great game of geopolitics and the competition between oligarchies and the establishment of these great wars that were taking place. So those are all existing kind of on the surface, actually. And then there was this deeper game that really I discussed throughout my book that has to do with secret science and technology and how that became a governance institution unto itself. And this governance institution is going to be the ultimate inheritor of this movement of technocracy. So as this technocracy, the systems of technocracy spread and become more thoroughly integrated into society, alongside that motion, we're going to see the rise of a new governance system, a new power structure that's going to ultimately displace the power structure that we know today as the deep state and the oligarchy. These are all things I discuss in the book and which we'll be exploring in this series. So while it's relatively clear to look at the relationship between Morgan and Tesla, what's not so simple and easy to figure out is if the paradigm of science and technology that Tesla was working with was also being researched and experimented with on by someone else. Perhaps a secret society or hidden branch of the burgeoning national security complex that was forming around these grand imperial clashes that were taking place, between European powers and between those powers in America. So who was going to rise to be victorious in the great game of hegemony? Well, that was the backdrop within which, as I said, this whole story of secret science, secret technology has to play out, has to deal with the realities of that real politic, as Mearsheimer would put it. So the question is, was Tesla's career foiled after his relationship with Morgan went south? Was it foiled not only by the capitalist class, the oligarchy, or was there also a secret scientific institution that was also not desiring to see him be successful? So the thing to remember about Tesla, he was a rogue kind of genius inventor. His discoveries really came from himself. The paradigm that he was working with was actually also being developed by groups of people, secret societies, and those secret organizations did not necessarily have an interest in seeing the technologies and ideas they were working with privately and wanted to keep private. They didn't necessarily have an interest in seeing Tesla be successful popularizing them and developing these public-facing solutions. And so they may have had an interest in also keeping Tesla's work submerged. So the question is, was Tesla's career foiled in part to preserve the secret entity's monopoly on the etheric energy paradigm? That's a legitimate question that I have. Remember, less than 10 years before JP Morgan shut down Tesla's Warren Cliff project, the 1890s flying airship sightings unexpectedly sprouted up, and they appeared relatively frequently over the course of a year and then rapidly disappeared. So what happened to this technology? And what happened to the mysterious organizations who created them? Now, again, these seem to have been independent of Tesla, so suggesting the fact that there were organizations and coordinated groups who were working with the same ideas that Tesla was working with, and that may have been a source of conflict, and Tesla might not have even been aware of it. He might not have been aware that he was being undermined by that. So it seems that there also, relating to these organizations and societies that were dealing with these flying airships, it seemed there may have been more than one engineering society involved in producing the 1890s airships. And one of the things that suggests that this might be true is the fact that in the accounts of these airships, these 1890s airships, which again, if you want to know more, you got to read the previous chapter. But there is widespread variation in the airship models that witnesses report having seen. And several decades earlier, Charles Delshow, who we talked about in the previous chapter, he stated that other airship societies existed beside the one that he was involved in. Delshow was really one of the only figures or only people that we have an entry point into this world of these airship societies. Again, this is from the mid to late 19th century. So there seems to have been multiple competing groups, at least at a certain point. After sporadic references to airship sightings in the 1860s and 1890s, however, how did it happen that all of a sudden a huge wave of these airships, ostensibly from different groups, appeared during a compact 1.5-year time span? This was in 1896 to 1897. Hundreds of newspaper reports describe accounts, particularly these are in the American West, Midwest and West. But there's hundreds of accounts of sightings of these airships and even them landing and encounters with the human occupants of these craft, and some transactions were had. So there were lots of reports. It seems like this is a real phenomenon that happened. So there's a huge wave of these flying airships, which aren't like Wright brothers airships. We're talking like they have a steampunk quality. They look like of the time period, kind of crude and rough, almost looking like ships actually. But they had the properties of anti-gravity and were able to fly around, supposedly leveraging something called telluric currents. But they were able to fly around and at high speeds. So again, mid to late 19th century. So how did it happen that this huge wave appeared all of a sudden, although there was sporadic mention of these airships going back several decades beforehand, but the first widespread sighting happens in 1896 to 1897, and then these sightings disappeared seemingly overnight. And then we never heard a single thing about it ever again. So what happened there? Were the groups behind these airships consolidated together? Did one group potentially eliminate the rest and seize control of the industry? This was the heyday of the robber baron, and those types of monopolistic practices were relatively common at that time. So that's possible. A hostile takeover could have occurred. And it was also the heyday of corporate consolidation and mergers, as exemplified in the Morgans, House of Morgan. So it's a possibility that they could have all been merged together. In any account, the idea that there were different societies, but the whole phenomenon disappeared at once does suggest a sudden coordination between them. So it makes me think that some event happened in 1897 that resulted in a blanket policy of submerging and sequestering the entire paradigm. And that's what I think happened. In Delshow's account of the Sonora Aero Club, which is the particular airship society that he was involved in, and this is the only one that we really have any kind of inside baseball about, he discussed how this group was forced to turn, for funding reasons, to an elite Prussian society called NIMSA for financial backing. And this mysterious Prussian organization, which is Prussia became basically the German Empire, this group wanted to weaponize the aero technology. The Arrows being their name for the flying airships. They wanted to weaponize this airship technology. This is back in like the 1860s or something, to advance their ambitions for German nationalism. So basically, Prussian society was funding research that was taking place in the rural expanses of the American West. And the idea seems to have been that the Prussians wanted to take this technology after it had been developed back home and use it for their own purposes. But the founder of the Sonora Aero Club, Peter Minnis, rejected their offer and was probably killed as a result because he died not long after in an accident. But an immediate question is, we hear from Delshow's account about NIMSA, this Prussian organization. Was there an equivalent American organization that we just haven't heard about? It seems likely. So this organization, if so, would have been a potential competitor to NIMSA and would have seen the potential of the airships and later of Tesla's inventions for advancing the geopolitical interests of the United States. Perhaps they made a move to capture this technology for themselves and to monopolize it, so no other country or competing group could weaponize it and use it against us. So better that nobody has it. The Americans won't even be allowed to have it. No nation state will have it. Instead, it'll be submerged and it'll be dealt with and protected at the level of a secret organization. In Germany's case, we know that Otto von Bismarck accomplished the unification of Germany without the use of these advanced technologies. Later, Germany would fight and lose 2 world wars without deploying them, suggesting they didn't have these technologies available to them in their arsenal. So again, in the 19th century, there is a reference to a Prussian involvement, a secret society, nationalist intentions, a Prussian group with knowledge about and interest in this technology. They might not have known the secrets of it, but they were aware that it existed. After this flying airship societies disappear, we never hear about this Prussian group again. And then Prussia / the German Empire would go on to fight 2 world wars and lose both of them. And never did they use any of these type of technologies that they were supposedly interested in back in the 19th century. So how do we explain this? What exactly happened here? Likewise, America, who I argue a group in America took control of this technology, but America fought those 2 world wars against Germany, and they also didn't use these technologies. And none of their generals or leadership, none of the politicians seem to have had any knowledge that these technologies even existed. So again, a third party, a secret organization or a secret society seemed to have taken control of the whole paradigm. So, when you read popular accounts of the 20th century, it's as if this whole thing never existed. But when you go into the history of the 19th century, you say, wait, it looks like it did exist. And somehow in the 20th century, it just disappears. And yet, while the flying airships in their original form, in the 1896, 1897 form, or in the form that Delschau talks about with the Snow Aero Club, these aero machines, while those never reappear again in their old forms, 50 years later, exactly 50 years later, after 1897, which would be around 1847, that's when the first modern wave of UFO sightings begin. So once again, now we have the reappearance of anti-gravity technologies. But when they reappear in 1947, they do so in a form that looks much different than the other form. Rather than the ship-looking kind of steampunk style of vehicle from the 1890s, 1897, in the new form, in the 1947 form, they look like metallic flying saucers. And in the 19th century version, it's clear that these airships were being flown by humans. There's no even question about aliens. There's no discussion about it. It's a human endeavor. It's secret societies that are tinkering with this new technology. When they reappear in 1947, there's a deliberate effort to associate these flying saucers with extraterrestrials or aliens. So that's a curious thing. It disappears for 50 years. The whole technology is transformed and then it's totally rebranded. And then since 1947, we've had basically 80 years of consistent UFO sightings. And they're demonstrating in a more advanced form the types of feats and accomplishments that witnesses in the late 19th century described the original flying airships as having demonstrated, such as anti-gravity. So we know that this ether-based anti-gravity paradigm of science and technology, we know it exists today because we have all these sightings. And now, even in more recent years, within the last decade, we have government reluctantly acknowledging the existence of these technologies, but basically not offering any detail beyond that. But they're recognizing the existence of these sightings, which by implication means that there is a mysterious paradigm of science and technology that exists demonstrably, but the majority of people, even within the government, can't explain what it is and where it comes from. Now, that could be aliens, could be a secret society as well. So these are all things that keep in mind as we're going on, because the reason I'm talking about all this and this discussion of technocracy is I don't think you can understand technocracy unless you understand these mysterious events that took place and the idea that there was a very advanced breakthrough system of science and technology. Because I think that's actually the driving force of the need to have a science and technology-based form of government, which is what technocracy is. So I think what we call technocracy has 2 forms. There's an outer form, and we can see that outer form incrementally being put into place, digital everything, Internet of Things, all that. Now there's a hidden side of technocracy that hasn't yet been revealed and integrated with this outer form, and that has to do with the secret science of this new secret energy paradigm. And when you put those things together, you really have a very powerful new era of governance that we're moving into, of civilization, and of our relationship with technology and science. And again, I don't think you can ever understand this phenomenon looking purely at the outer form. And that's why I really devoted this book to researching this inner story, this concealed story. Now, another element beyond just the modern sightings of UFOs and the coming out of whistleblowers and things like that to talk about the existence of these research programs that the government has been sponsoring to not only study UFOs, but as is often framed, to replicate them. Again, under the assumption that these are alien technologies, that we're going to be reverse engineering them. Again, I think that you can explain this same dynamic, not referencing aliens, but talking about secret societies. But nonetheless, we have these data points, and that offers important evidence to this theory I'm developing. Another thing that offers evidence to it is the idea that we have had not only government whistleblowers talking about the existence of government programs, but we've also had a number of innovators, kind of in the mold of Tesla, lone inventors, come along through the years, through the decades, and make certain breakthroughs in this field or in this paradigm. And in every single case, we have accounts and testimonies from these inventors that some mysterious force swooped in and basically shut down their work. And this happens over and over again. And again, that's another key piece of information that helps us unravel this mystery of what seems to be happening. So factoring in all this information, we're left to conclude that whatever entity rose up in America around the turn of the 20th century to consolidate and take control over the etheric energy paradigm, that one of the primary goals of this entity was to make this entire school of thought disappear from outside awareness. And not just from the general public, but also from the government, the overt government, from the capitalist oligarchy, from the military industrial complex, and the whole institution of empire that is now growing and expanding around the world. That system of American empire, the outer system of it, actually seems to conceal a core that it doesn't even realize that it's doing that. So if we switch our perspective, the core seems to be almost like a hidden hand that's gradually steering how this outer empire builds itself out. And at the right time, it'll reveal itself and take control of the empire that has been set up. And the trajectory of this empire is moving more and more into the direction of technocracy, science and technology. And so the digital information grid, all the institutions and the technologies that are being set up now as part of this global system of empire that are moving in the direction of technocracy, that whole system is perfectly designed for this hidden entity to come in and take control of and run its new energy-based society using these new systems. And it can centrally coordinate the global transformation of society in alignment with this new paradigm. And I think that that's what's happening here. So in other words, the American deep state, which seems all-powerful, appears to have been deliberately kept in the dark about etheric energy. And the architecture of its global empire operates entirely on the plane of the conventional science and technology that we are taught in school. So etheric energy technologies are nowhere to be found in the rise of the American empire. And yet there's always references that they seem to exist in the middle of the American empire. So they're not used, but they're there. And we also see reference to the existence of these things in certain classified documents that have been released by whistleblowers. And when you hear discussion of the plans and visions and dreams of oligarchs like J.P. Morgan or the Rockefellers or Gates, they seem to not have any idea about this hidden system that exists. They're just not read into it. They don't know about it. It's been compartmentalized away from them. And yet they play important roles, and they are powerful within certain domains of the empire. They have little fiefdoms that they're influential in, and the Rockefellers, they have many different fiefdoms that they're influential in, and yet they don't seem to penetrate into the most important branch, which is the secret science and technology. So something else has emerged separate from the deep state, operating behind and below and beneath it and above it, depending how you want to look at it. But it's sheltered from the deep state's view, and it seems to also penetrate its operations and guide its behavior from beneath the shadows. I mean, it has to penetrate its operations to maintain its own secrecy. So it's everywhere, but it's invisible. And in many ways, it acts like a secret society. And one of its goals is to keep the deep state, not just the general public, but probably more importantly, the deep state factions, ignorant of etheric energy. While at the same time, it needs those deep state actors to move in the direction and accomplish certain goals that have to do with globalization and setting the stage for the transformational release and revelation of this breakthrough but classified paradigm. So, lacking a formal name, I call this mysterious scientific and technological gatekeeping institution that formed at some point in the late 19th century the Technocratic Superstate. That's what I call it. It doesn't have an official name. We don't have any official releases from this entity, but we can infer using a blend of induction and deduction and analogy. We can use all those analytical resources, bring them together, and we can infer its existence with a great degree of probability. So in my theory, the Technocratic Superstate's mission is to serve as the primary custodian of the etheric energy paradigm, both in terms of its scientific study and technological applications. It alone is empowered to dictate if, when, and how etheric energy-based science and technologies are to be revealed and put to use. In effect, it works like a think tank mixed with an intelligence agency and a secret society. I posit that it is organized hierarchically around a central scientific brain trust, one that operates in secret, pursuing in isolation the scientific mastery of the ether. It has a strong perspective and set of preferences about ongoing geopolitical developments. Of course it would. Using America as its headquarters, it projects various networks out from itself, which extend down into basically every other sector of society at every level. And it exerts a covert influence everywhere because in order to preserve a secret like that, you have to be able to act at every dimension of society. Otherwise, in the scientific age, certain scientific discoveries almost seem inevitable, and you have had many different innovators and pioneers and brilliant minds come upon their own independent realization, much like Tesla did, of this paradigm. I'm going to be doing a case study of one of them coming up, a guy named Adam Trombley. I'm going to be doing a breakdown of a very long interview that he did. And I've cited him in some of my other work before. He's someone who followed in the footsteps of Tesla. And he wanted to actually try to re-put together Tesla's formulas and his ideas, particularly when it comes to designing an energy generation system that draws energy from the ether, or from the vacuum as it's sometimes called, but really it's the ether. And he was successful. And he, as we'll talk about in this interview, he demonstrated this technology in, I think, 1989 in front of a large audience of very influential people in New York City at the UN, I believe. He demonstrated this technology, and then more or less, whole operations was within the next decade were completely shut down, and it was never allowed to come out. And so he talks about his interactions with this mysterious force that basically moved in and shut the whole thing down. So that whole story is a entry point into understanding this phenomena that I talk about of the technocratic superstate. So this institution uses America as its headquarters, and one of its goals is to conceptualize a long-term strategy for guiding civilization toward a future state where the truths about the science and technology of etheric energy can finally be revealed. And when they're able to be revealed, they can actually finally be put to use to revolutionize a struggling and demoralized global civilization. So the vision that they would have formulated would have been fine-tuned and then incrementally put into practice over the course of decades, or even over a century by this point. And basically, its approach to social governance is really social engineering. It has to act like a hidden hand, and all the different elements of society are basically different elements within one system that has to engineer towards a certain outcome. In other words, it would think of things in terms of an engineering problem. So I think it's good to think of this institution as a social engineering entity. Being the foremost expert in etheric energy, the technocratic superstate would alone have access to the most complete set of information about what dangers and potentials the etheric energy paradigm offers us, and what type of social order is needed to both optimize its use and minimize the possibility of its misuse, which could have catastrophic consequences if allowed to occur. And Tesla in the 30s, I think, 1930s, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, I think it was. He talks about some of these misuses or some of the possible consequences that could arise from the misuse of etheric energy. And if you just read that analysis, which I share in my book in a different section, it's clear that there is the need to definitely keep this whole paradigm under a tight watch. And if you're ever going to implement it, it has to be within a very controlled environment. Like the government needs to be able to monitor people's ability to weaponize this system because you might only ever get one chance to prevent it. That's how powerful it is. And it's also not something that you need $1 billion facility to begin to make an impact using. With a few $1,000s of equipment, I think you can set up a series of amplifying wavelengths that can cause some serious damage, if not even destroy the whole planet. So that's a reality that has to be dealt with when you're talking about this paradigm of science and technology. And it's very relevant to the decision to keep it secret all these years. So in that sense, you can kind of relate to the technocratic superstate and the decision to keep this whole paradigm secret until such point that an appropriate governance system, a global governance system, could be put in place to monitor the unfoldment of this paradigm of science and technology. So you need a new governance system. And that's what I argue technocracy is ultimately going to do, is it's designed to be the governance system of this new energy paradigm. So the first requirement that I imagine exists for the safe use of etheric energy is global government. The etheric field that extends throughout the earth is innately global in its presence, and this property should be matched by a system of global governance which can coordinate its use. Very simple logic. One of the primary tasks of this global governance system must be to ensure that etheric energy is utilized according to the natural laws that govern its applications and its operations. While etheric energy offers the promise of incredible technologies and bountiful energy, it also has strict rules which must be followed for its safe use. To break these rules or otherwise misuse this energy, such as by weaponizing it, will almost certainly have catastrophic consequences for the planet. The second requirement for the use of etheric energy is the adoption of a new economic system beyond capitalism. The profit motive, traditionally tied to accumulating material wealth, becomes irrelevant because etheric energy isn't a commodity to hoard. It's an abundant resource accessible to all. Instead of money, the system's currency might be instead designed to be a measure of etheric energy flow or resonance, which could be allocated based on an individual or community's contribution to the overall energetic equilibrium of the planet. So this is a very different mindset and system design than what we find in capitalism, which is about financial gain. So in the new economy, or the new technocratic economy, production and innovation would focus on technologies or practices like etheric amplifiers, resonance fields, or bioenergetic devices, which enhance the collective's ability to tap into and utilize this energy resource. The incentive wouldn't be profit in this new dimension, but rather achieving optimal use of etheric energy. So the third requirement then, after these first two, would be the creation of a global university system. This is key, which will serve as a cultural foundation for the new energy economy, the new technocratic economy. The primary purpose of this university is to standardize and coordinate the education and training of the workforce across the globe, while also serving to bind global cultures into a common framework of scientific knowledge and philosophical understanding. In an etheric energy-based society, distinctions are blurred between the public and private sectors, and topics like science, religion, and culture no longer become as firmly demarcated as they are today. A global university can serve as the breeding ground for the synthesis of these elements, while also directly linking them to society's economic and political institutions, so that society as a whole functions much more holistically. So what I mean by this is that the education system can really unite all these different things together, because in education, all things really are united. So in education, as we become more knowledgeable, we also learn how to behave more intelligently and to discipline ourselves, and that opens up new pathways of religious experience. So that in that way, science and religion can go together within an education institution. Likewise, the politicians could have a requirement or even just a norm that the people that you're going to vote to office should be graduates of this institution. The institution really is the vetting process, that its graduates are now vetted and they're now eligible to be good governors of society. So they're eligible for election. So that's another way that an education system, it makes sense for it to be enthroned as the centerpiece of society rather than a secondary or tertiary institution like we have today. So this approach, this framework, describes the central thesis of this book as it pertains to technocracy. According to my theory, at the beginning of the 20th century, as the imperially focused institutions of the US deep state began to focus their energies around supporting the rise of a powerful American oligarchy and the expansion of American and financial oligarchical power and influence around the world in the form of empire. While this was all happening, there also emerged, unbeknownst to this deep state, a secret scientific institution concealed deep within its structure, combining elements of a think tank, intelligence agency, and secret society. It has maintained its own independent scientific power structure, one distinct from the capitalistic and militaristic power structures that tend to dominate the US deep state. When we focus on the deep state, we tend to think the most powerful people are the capitalists and the military planners and generals and maybe the politicians. But when you factor in this technocratic superstate, then there's also, you come to understand another level of power, which is the power of knowledge of breakthrough energy and technology, and knowledge of advanced sciences that are much more advanced, completely different even from the sciences that the capitalists and militarists and politicians that they're aware of and use to fulfill their purposes. The deep state, we call the deep state, is using actually a very limited range of potential technologies that they could be using if they had full access and awareness to this deeper paradigm. And that would be quite frightening, because then they really could solidify themselves as the permanent neo-feudal rulers of the planet. But that situation hasn't happened. I mean, these people are still very powerful, the deep state and the factions involved, but they're not all powerful, because they don't have access to the most important resources and technologies that they could potentially have been using this whole time. So keep that in mind. So again, this institution of the technocratic superstate combines elements of a think tank, intelligence agency, and secret society, and it maintains its own independent power structure, science-based, and distinct from capitalism and the military-industrial complex. Its operations covertly penetrate into the deep state, even though it's concealed from the deep state. Its operations definitely penetrate into it and quietly influence the activities of its various factions. It basically ensures that they're not going to move in the direction of this breakthrough scientific paradigm, so it's going to stay separate from them. They're not allowed to know about it. At the same time, they must accomplish certain goals that have to do with globalization and this move towards technocracy. So this is a group that is the target of a lot of manipulation by the technocratic superstate. So just as today we see the deep state and we say they're controlling our society and they're influencing every aspect of our society secretly, that same relationship dynamic is also true within the deep state in relation to the technocratic superstate. The technocratic superstate has influenced and infiltrated the deep state, and it is continually doing so, and is probably involved in all aspects of their operations. But in order to keep this dynamic alive, in the sense that it's secret and the deep state doesn't know that this is happening, there's a boundary to how much you can really influence that group. Meaning, you can't step in and censure one of their activities if they're doing something horrible like the Gaza genocide, financing that and orchestrating that. If the technocratic superstate would say, okay, you crossed the line, we're going to come in and say you can't do that anymore, all of a sudden it's not secret anymore. So it's limited in what it can say, what it says the groups can and can't do. Instead, really what it does is it affects their decision-making environment. It takes certain things off the table, and so they're not even aware of it. So then when they're making their machinations about how to run the empire and control things, they're doing so in a way that's quote-unquote safe for the technocratic superstate. It preserves their interests for secrecy. That doesn't necessarily mean that the technocratic superstate, the secret scientific entity, likes everything that the empire is doing or would do it this way if they were in charge. But because the whole thing about the secrecy is that they can't be in charge. They can only really operate around their mandate to keep this paradigm secret, and then to try to engineer the outer system, which includes the deep state, but also the overt government, to engineer that system towards whatever long-term outcome it needs, which is global technocratic infrastructure put in place. So that's the long-term need. If it can have that, then it can finally reveal itself and release and control the use of these new technologies. But until that system is put in place, it's really handicapped in what it can do. So this institution, the Technocratic Superstate, has established certain criteria that global society or global civilization must achieve before it will ever allow the etheric energy paradigm to be revealed and released. Like I said, this criteria is global government and technocracy. So until these are achieved, since it must maintain a veil of secrecy around itself to safekeep the etheric energy technologies that it possesses, it can't openly advocate for these policies or directly lead the way into the new etheric era. Remember, since its inception, the Technocratic Superstate's inception, it has been operating within a background context of empire and capitalism. These things were already existing in the 19th century when I argue this institution was formed. And at that time, also the industrial and scientific ages were still in their early phases of development. So we're a long way off from global technocracy at the point of the late 19th century. So by the time that the scientists of the Technocratic Superstate would have come to the conclusion that global government was an unavoidable necessity for etheric energy technologies to ever be revealed and put to use, there was already another entity pursuing global government for its own purposes, the Anglo-American establishment, or the transatlantic capital class. And the plan of this group, as Carol Quigley said earlier, was to create a global financial imperium rooted in the establishment of a privately owned international central banking cartel. And their agenda was, if they could control the money supply of the planet through a global central banking cartel, then they would be the de facto oligarchs in charge of global government. And so the oligarchs behind the central banking system in this dream of theirs would be able to basically dictate the governance policies of every nation on earth. So they didn't want to become dictators to all the nations. They wanted to do basically what they're doing now, is control the governments of nation states by centrally controlling the global monetary system. So that's the vision of global government that the Anglo-American establishment has been pursuing for basically 100 and something years. So that's the real politics, so to speak, that the Technocratic Superstate is dealing with. That's the situation that it inherited upon its birth. And so I argue that the Technocratic Superstate leveraged the ambitions of this transatlantic capitalist oligarchy to lay the groundwork for its own plans for global government. And so it has to manipulate the oligarchy to set up the systems that it needs in order to eventually take control. And so therefore, while the oligarchs pursue globalization for their own purposes, and we can track that story over the past 100 years through the two world wars, UN, Cold War, Federal Reserve, Bank of International Settlements, all that stuff, we can track it. And we can track the role that economic and military power of American empire, how that was deployed to implement this global financial capitalist system. But under the surface of that, what we don't have access to, but we can infer exists, was that this Technocratic Superstate was gradually concealing itself within, but also manipulating how this global American empire built itself out. And we can basically infer or assume that its plans were ultimately to drive the American empire in a direction that it could eventually take control over at the appropriate time. And in the process, excise or sacrifice or cut out the oligarchs who have thus far been in control, at least outwardly. So when the Technocratic Superstate finally reveals itself, that'll be the end of what we call the deep state. So for this plan to succeed, the preservation of secrecy is absolutely paramount. And the monopoly on etheric energy must be maintained within the Technocratic Superstate. And to accomplish this, and to maintain its own secrecy, it basically has no choice but to become a hidden hand that is moving in and interfering with the pace of scientific and technological development, not just within the outer society, such as like when new inventors come, they, like Adam Trombley, they come in and participate in the destruction and confiscation of their research. So that's one thing, but the other thing is to basically shut it down and consolidate it and keep it out of the hands of the oligarchs and the power structures behind the American empire. So that's this complicated dynamic, strategic dynamic that the Technocratic Superstate is faced with. That's the strategic situation that it is enmeshed in. Now, if the existence of the etheric energy technology would ever be revealed to the robber barons behind global capitalism, they would almost inevitably try to wrest control of this technology and put it to use in the pursuit of their own selfish ambitions. And for this reason, the technocratic superstate would have deemed it necessary to create a boundary between itself and this capitalist oligarchy, preventing access to the science and technology that it exclusively possesses. But it wouldn't be enough for the technocratic superstate to merely stay hidden. It would also be necessary for it to infiltrate at every level the empire building operations of the deep state. Its aim being to keep it away from etheric energy and use the architecture of its global empire as a means to incrementally seed into place the infrastructure for the future global technocratic governance system it plans to eventually transition the world into. So to summarize now, according to my theory, beginning sometime around the turn of the last century, agents of a newly formed scientific institution, the technocratic superstate, infiltrated the networks of America's deep state, centered around its capitalist oligarchy, in order to influence its activities from behind the scenes. The strategic goal was to use the deep state as a mask to quietly build out from behind the scenes the foundations of what will one day become a global technocratic governance system, something the technocratic superstate requires before it openly reveals the transformative world-changing technologies it possesses. That's the summary. At the time the technocratic superstate first formed, an Anglo-American syndicate of financial elite was already deep in pursuit of a global capitalistic imperium, with America serving as the headquarters of its empire, and this has remained the case for 100 years. In this environment, the technocratic superstate could work in the shadows of the deep state and piggyback off its momentum, thereby working toward the creation of its global technocratic governance system without ever having to declare itself or declare its existence or its intentions, you see? So there was already this force in America, this capitalist oligarchy, that had globalist ambitions, and we already talked about what those were. So it could coast in the wake of that. It could ride the wake of it. It could conceal itself and then ride that momentum and then incrementally shape how this empire was built by the oligarchy. It could gradually steer the oligarchy in the digital technocratic direction, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And really the culmination of that would be something like what we saw in 2020 with the global coordination of this scientific apparatus around COVID. Now, that's kind of a complicated situation to analyze, but in many ways it's indicative of this situation dynamic that's taking place, because the COVID apparatus, the scientific technological aspect of that was pushing COVID, that is operating on the materialistic paradigm of science. The whole virology, the allopathic medicine is all scientific materialism. In other words, it's the version of science that has had the ether wiped away from it, taken away from it. So we don't infer that the technocratic superstate was behind that operation. Instead, it was basically an eruption of a type of consequence that arises from a system that's plagued with secrecy. If the true science of human health and hygiene and medicine were ever to be revealed, it would directly implicate this idea of the ether. You actually can't understand human health without the ether. And that's one of the reasons why Western medicine struggles so much, is because it wants to understand human health entirely on the level of scientific materialism and reductionism. And it'll never work. It can only look at individual parts. It can never understand how the whole thing comes together as a living being. And that holism is the foundation of health. And so the whole COVID apparatus is really an apparatus set up around this reductionist scientific materialist model and all the other implications that come around with that, the worldview that comes around with that, the values of it. And those things have become institutionalized within the medical system and within our governmental institutions and within the oligarchy. The worldview is very immature and really dangerous that it's been allowed to fester and grow within the oligarchy. And then essentially it's in a state of arrested development because it's never allowed to develop in the direction that might reveal the existence of these etheric perspectives. An etheric perspective on medicine would be transformative, but we're not allowed to have that yet because we don't have the appropriate governance system put in place to safely reveal it. So while that remains secret, we still have this compulsion and this upwelling tendency within the oligarchy to move and embrace science and technology, but it's embracing a particular version of science and technology that is locked on a very superficial level. And so I think that we have to understand some of those complex dynamics as informing what happened in COVID. And I would say a similar thing about what's happening in Gaza. We have this great catastrophe, but it comes from a situation in which you have to have an empire that relies on relationships with very extractive and destructive elements that really can't be regulated or are designed not to be regulated. And so it becomes a breeding ground for the shadow, the Jungian shadow to upwell and emerge. And we really see the existence of the shadow both in this Israel situation and also in the COVID situation. A shadow complex has to be dealt with on the level of revelation, on the level of transparency and realization, self-realization. Because the shadow is concealing something always. And so you have to get into the thing that it's concealing. So that's why we'll never have a solution to what happened during COVID and get justice for that until we're ready to have the upwelling of the thing that it is concealing, that the scientific, imperial, technological apparatus that has been put in place over the past 80 years of American empire, this structure, it's sort of entered a terminal stage in its behavior. It's become utterly psychotic, but it can't be fixed until this deeper revelation is ready to happen. And I'm not part of the technocratic superstate. I don't know when that is or what its timetable is or what it wants before it makes the next step in its revelation process. But we do know that something has to happen there before we can actually deal with any of our problems out on the surface of society. So my ultimate theory is that the outer institutions of the deep state and the various branches of it, which go into things like the Great Reset and World Economic Forum and Bank of International Settlements and the move to digital currency and all these things. This outer structure of the empire, the deep state, is moving towards its own end game, which is global government. But it's an imperial, centralized system, very neo-feudalist. But that it does have an end game, and it is working towards that end game. The technocratic superstate is also working towards its end game. It has a different future that it envisions. But nonetheless, it does have a vision that it wants, and it's been pursuing it. And those two visions are not in alignment, other than the fact that they're both globalized. And they both feature science and technology in their final forms, but different approaches to science and technology, different values and totally different understandings of life and mankind's engagement with life. These are things that arise from these very different understandings of science and technology. And so my theory is that once the deep state makes its move to achieve its final end game of global empire, that this is when the technocratic superstate will rise up and displace the apparatus. In a way, this is what happened. COVID was part of the end game of this imperial system. So COVID, in many ways, was an expression of the deep state's end game, which we're still playing out. At the same time, we also had concurrently with the release of government acknowledgement of the UFO program. And that you pull on that thread, you get the technocratic superstate. So it tells me that the more the UFO program gets revealed and discussed, that represents the technocratic superstate moving towards its end game. And we'll have to see how these end games end up coming together. But my ultimate feeling is that when the deep state makes this move to enthrone itself as the lord over this global governance system that it wants, that's when the technocratic superstate will rise up and displace that entire governing apparatus and install in its place a new global technocratic governance system, which it will be the governor over. So if we imagine this technocratic superstate is centered around a think tank, that think tank will then become the new administrative body of this global energy system. That's my prediction. I want you to understand, I'm not advocating for any of this. This is my analysis and my prediction of what will happen. I think you can work with this. You bring in some philosophic aspects, some of the vision of Plato, some of the vision of Francis Bacon, some of the vision of Manly Hall. You can move that into this technocratic motion, and you can really start to do some good things and some transformative things with this. So I think you can work with it. But I'm not advocating for any of this. It's not my place to advocate for it. I'm giving you my analysis. This is what I think is happening. I think the deep state is moving towards its end game, and a secret scientific institution is also moving towards its end game, and its moves will ultimately displace this deep state. We will never see the World Economic Forum's vision for the future of globalization. That will never come true. But what will happen is that the infrastructure that the World Economic Forum is putting in place to accomplish its end game will be taken over and used for a different purpose by this deeper technocratic superstate entity. So that's my prediction. So to reemphasize, this is the conclusion. A single integrated system of world government built upon technocratic foundations is a core requirement that the technocratic superstate requires before it can safely reveal and put to use the breakthrough etheric technologies that it possesses. So long as the world remains trapped in the dynamic of competitive geopolitics, where nation states militarily and economically compete with each other for world domination, it is necessary for etheric energy technologies to remain concealed. These technologies are far too dangerous to be used for competitive purposes. Therefore, a unified system of global government where international warfare is eliminated is a baseline requirement for the revelation of etheric energy, the whole paradigm, to ever occur. Until this condition is established, the great scientific and technological revolution that will come alongside with this revelation of etheric energy must be delayed and remain secret. The challenge for the scientists and social engineers of the technocratic superstate is that they cannot openly lead the charge to establish global government or transition the economy from capitalism to technocracy, while at the same time keeping their existence secret. For this reason, they have had to operate using the deep state as its front organization, taking advantage of the compartmentalization and culture of secrecy that defines the deep state in order to pursue its secret objectives without detection. The technocratic superstate would have had no choice but to form an uneasy alliance with the capitalist oligarchy, who were already self-motivated to pursue the creation of a global empire and well-positioned to succeed. Riding the coattails of this agenda, the technocratic superstate concealed itself in the shadows of the deep state's power grab, all the while quietly working in pursuit of its long-term grand vision for global government, a etheric energy-based system of global government. They work to pursue this from behind the scenes, and that is the secret history, the secret underlying motion that has defined the past 200 years of history. I'm convinced of that, and I make the case for that in my book, not only in this chapter that we're going to be going through in this series, but through the entire contents of this book, which was basically 15 years in the making. And it is an original work. It presents an original thesis. So that's it for this episode. In the next one, part 2 of this series, we're going to look at the origin of technocracy, and we're going to go a little bit more in the details of how I posit that there are 2 different forms of technocracy, an outer form and an inner form. The outer form is really where the word technocracy comes from. We can track the birth of technocracy dating back to the 1920s and 1930s with the rise of an intellectual movement in New York. This is during the time period of first the Roaring 20s and then the Great Depression. So that was the backdrop for the original birth of technocracy. Now, the thinkers and the intellectuals who first conceived of this system of economic organization, which they intended as a replacement for capitalism, their thinking is very much influenced by conventional paradigms of science and technology. So the original thinkers who came up with or envisioned a system in which science and technology would become the centerpiece of government rather than capitalism and markets and money, those thinkers, they had a lot of good ideas, and they actually had very sound criticism in many ways of capitalism. But what they didn't have was the complete understanding of what potential science and technology really entailed. And so they envisioned an energy-based system of government, of economic organization, but this energy-based system that they envisioned was confined on the level of conventional energy, carbon-based fuel sources, coal and petroleum and things like that. So that was the extent of their ability to conceive technocracy. And that limitation still exists within the mainstream technocracy movement. By mainstream, I mean the World Economic Forum. The aspect of the technocracy movement you can see, that we can track taking place, the Palantirs and all that. The fact of the matter is the vision of science and technology that these groups that are advocating for a science and technology-based system of society, the version of science and technology that they're dealing with is confined on the level of the conventional. And that really handicaps how deeply they can envision what the possibilities of a science and technology-based society could be. Now, when you add in the either, that becomes very powerful, it becomes really transformative. So you take a science and technology-based society that's informed by the either, and that becomes the basis of a totally gigantic revolution in the affairs of human civilization. but that's not able to be conceived by them because they are locked on a level. So the word technocracy specifically comes from this group that's locked on a level. We don't know what the version of government that this secret scientific organization came up with. We don't have that name for that. But presumably it's centered around science and technology and is based around energy, which are the core features of the aspect of technocracy that we can see and that we can name. So for this reason, I think it's appropriate to call this deeper entity the technocratic superstate, but then the outer version of technocracy is really the one that most analysts, or basically all the analysts, are discussing. So in the next section, the origin of technocracy, we're going to be looking at this outer version, the circumstances around which it first emerged, and we'll be discussing as we continue in this series what the differences are specifically between the outer version and the inner version, or the exoteric and esoteric versions of technocracy. So with that, I'm going to conclude this episode. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. The written version of this chapter is available on my Substack, and everybody's able to read that. And the paid subscribers to my Substack can download the whole book of The Coming World Nation and access the whole chapter. So again, thanks everybody for tuning in. This is Alex Sachon with the Wisdom Tradition Podcast, and thanks and God bless.